Good afternoon. Welcome to SEARAC Community Call on Education, which will cover what's happening in schools across the country and how it will affect our kids. So I want to welcome you to our community call. My name is Rita Pinn-Ahrens. I'm the Director of Education Policy at SEARAC. We're also joined by my colleague, Suvan Lee, who is a Policy Associate at SEARAC. And Suvan's going to lead us through some logistics.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. So just really quickly, on the screen here, you'll see some screenshots of your dashboard. First of all, let's make sure that you dial in a PIN if you want to talk later and ask questions. And then next to that PIN, you will see this green arrow in hand. Press that button if you want to talk or ask a question. Alternatively, if you don't want to ask a question over the phone, you can chat us in this box here. And then also, as a note, after the webinar, we have a survey, 2 questions. So it's really quick, and it would really help us for future webinars if you could help us answer those questions.
Okay, great. So for what we're trying to accomplish today on this webinar, we're going to discuss who we are at SEARAC Education. We're going to cover 3 big issues that our team is looking at. And also, we're going to cover what you can do as an education advocate. So in terms of SEARAC Education, our job here at SEARAC is to amplify the voices of Southeast Asian American students and families in the national discourse on education. As part of the civil rights community, SEARAC is dedicated to strengthening the advocacy capacity of leaders like yourself nationwide. So we do that in 3 distinct policy areas. The first is API data disaggregation. We have 3 big projects going on: the continuation of our All Students Count campaign, monitoring of state legislation, as well as providing public comments on data collection processes at the federal government. The second policy area that we are closely focused on is language access. So the 3 big projects there is FAFSA translation legislation, which we hope to introduce later this year. We're also looking at advocating for English language learners in the K-12 public schools, as well as making sure that parents are supported to support their students. In addition, we are also monitoring civil rights complaints that are related to language access in several states. The third big policy priority that SEARAC Education focuses on is culturally relevant programming. This includes after-school programs to make sure that high school students stay in school. It also includes elevating the need for AAPI funding. And for those who don't know, AAPIs are Asian American, Native American, Pacific Islander serving institutions. So they're the colleges that are equivalent to the historically Black colleges and universities and to Hispanic serving institutions, but for our community members. The third area that we look at under culturally relevant programming is cultural competency training for educators. So now I want to transition over to one of the first big issues that is happening across the country right now. And that's that states are now revising their education plans to comply with the new federal education law, the Every Student Succeeds Act, which replaced the No Child Left Behind Act. So this year, states are rewriting their plans, and those plans are expected to begin implementation this fall. So what's at stake for our communities is that these education plans set all of the ground rules for what happens in all public schools in the state, and that includes charter schools. And just as a note, the last time that states did a huge major revision of their plans was in 2002, after No Child Left Behind was enacted. So you can see here that it has been 15 years since states have revised their plans So it may be another 10 to 15 years before states do another major revision. So it's very important that you're involved in this process because the new law requires that stakeholders like you are consulted in the process of states revising their plans. So just to go over some deadlines, there were really two major deadlines for states to submit their plans, April 3rd, 2017 and September 18, 2017. Because the Department of Education revised the template that they had for the state plans, states were given the option of turning in their plans on May 3rd instead of April 3rd. So we've provided a list of states that have already submitted their education plans, as well as states who are intending to submit in May. And SEARAC is committed to analyzing the following states, which have really high Southeast Asian American populations, including California, Illinois, Massachusetts, Minnesota, North Carolina, Rhode Island, Washington, and Wisconsin. If we have capacity after analyzing these plans, we also would like to take a look at Texas and Virginia and Pennsylvania. So I want to go over what are the major components for these new education plans and what you as Southeast Asian American advocates should be looking for. State plans actually cover a wide range of things. They're several hundred pages long, but there are primarily 5 key areas that we think you should be looking at. The first is accountability, which is how schools are identified for improvement, what indicators are being used to measure those schools, and how much they weigh. In the past, schools were judged solely on math and English language arts tests. In the new ESSA, there are multiple indicators that can be used for accountability. The second area that we think you should take a look at are what are the long-term versus short-term goals. In the ESSA, there's a new requirement that states have to provide not only the deadlines for these short and long-term goals, but also what they are. It can be a single goal or it can be multiple goals. So it's important to see what the time frame for improvement within your state is. The third area that we think you should pay attention to in your state education plan is the area of assessments. So not only how many tests are being taken, at which grade levels, which subjects, but also how should English language learners and students with disabilities be accommodated. The fourth area that's really important to pay attention to for our communities are the area of what is being done with English language learners. So it is a new requirement within ESSA that a state must have a single process for identifying English learners and for exiting them from English learner status. Under No Child Left Behind, districts could have different processes for identifying and exiting English learners. So now the difference is how English learners can be accommodated at the district level, but the state has to have consistent identification and exit criteria, and they have to have a basic threshold for accommodating English learners on assessments. The fifth area that we think is of importance for our communities is to determine what languages the state is identifying as significant within the state. Because if the state identifies, say, Vietnamese or Cambodian, it means that they will translate assessments into those languages and also provide other supports directly to parents for those languages. So it's very important that our languages are identified as significant in our state.
Yeah, so going into a little bit more detail of what Rita had mentioned, the indicators within the accountability system, for every state, there's going to be 2 groups of them. There are academic indicators and non-academic indicators. So for Illinois, they've chosen these academic indicators. State test scores, and essentially that's how well students are performing in math and English language arts. Individual student growth, if 9th grade students are on track to graduate, and then high school graduation rates, and then as well as English language learner students' proficiency levels. And then the group of non-academic indicators will include chronic absenteeism, so that's about students' attendance, and then also surveys of school climate. So what we mean by school climate is the students' perception of the school's learning environment. And the state of Illinois plans to survey all of their students to assess what the school climate is. And then there's also access to the fine arts.
Just to scale back a little bit, I wanted to note that we are going over Illinois as an example because they are one of the states that has already submitted their state plan. So we'll be using Illinois as a template for showing you the different things that you should be paying attention to as an advocate.
Thank you, Rita. Yes, and what Rita also mentioned earlier were about long-term and short-term goals. So the state of Illinois has planned 15 years of 7 different goals that they hope to achieve by the year 2032. And they have also chosen to reassess and measure their progress towards those 15-year goals every 3 years. So that's their short-term goal. And then in terms of the assessment, so these are the tests that students will take to measure how proficient they're performing in math, English language arts, and science. So Illinois has chosen to use tests from PARC. PARC is a group, it was developed by a group of multiple states and university researchers, and then 11th grade students are going to be taking the SAT test. Different states will may use SAT tests, they may not. Different states may use PARC assessments and they may not. So it's just important to note that Illinois will be using these kind of tests for their students. Another thing about the English learners is that in the Illinois state plan, they actually don't tell us how they're going to accommodate English language learners when they're taking these tests. So I think that's an important thing to keep an eye out for. And then, as Rita mentioned about significant languages and identifying these so that you can translate tests for them, Illinois has only identified Spanish as a significant language. But I think it's also important to note that the top 5 languages spoken by ELs in Illinois are Spanish, Arabic, Polish, Chinese, and Urdu.
And just to emphasize why it's important to pay attention to English learners and the significant languages and how they're doing, can you share with us, Suvan, what the reclassification rate for students who exit English language learner status is in Illinois?
Yeah, so that rate is only 20%. So that's only 1 out of every 5 EL students will be reclassified.
Okay, and I think it's important to note that because it potentially could get worse if the only language that is identified as significant in Illinois is Spanish.
So some of the highlights and concerns that we saw from Illinois was that they're going to have 4 different categories of measuring how well schools are performing. One good thing actually is that former English language learner students will have their own category for accountability. And that's going to be separate from students that are currently identified as the English language learners.
And this is good for our students because once they exit English language learner status, they're no longer receiving those extra supports. So we need to know whether they're really on track to be on par with students that are not classified as English language learners. Because if they're not doing well as former English learners, then they should be either going back into English language learner status or getting different supports.
Yep. And then one more thing to note about long-term goals is that, Illinois is targeting 60% of their residents to either earn college degrees or professional certifications by 2025.
And while some people may think that this is a lofty goal for 60% of residents to have a college degree or a professional certification, I would point out that that means 40% of residents, they're okay with 40% of the residents not having a college degree or a professional certification. So the question is this bar too low, considering that in today's world, you actually do need to have higher than a high school degree to get a decent paying job. So by 2025, is it even more important for more of our students to have that college degree or professional certification?
Yeah, and then some of the other concerns that we had, so Rita earlier talked about identifying significant languages. And the key here is that those states must translate tests for significant languages they've identified. They get to define what that threshold for significant, what significant is. So Illinois has identified that as 60% of their EL students must be speaking one particular language for it to be considered significant.
So that really means that we will only ever have one significant language in Illinois, and that most likely will be Spanish. This is important because other states have identified more than one significant language, and they've committed to having translated assessments in more than one language. And so if you're an advocate in Illinois, this is something that you could actually be pushing for to say, hey, Illinois, we want more languages identified as significant.
And then a few more concerns that we had, right, was one, there's no data disaggregation of AAPI students. And then two, finally, the indicator for how proficient EL students are doing only counts for 5% of a school's rating. And, we think that's rather low, and we think they could actually have set it higher.
Right, and just to, emphasize that point, this percentage could have been set at 10%, it could have been 20, 25%. So for example, Suban had mentioned earlier that high school graduation rates were one of the academic indicators. In Illinois, high school graduation rates count for 50% of a school's rating, whereas English language proficiency is only 5%. That means that a school could essentially fail to meet all of its goals for English learners, and it could still be considered a top-rated school. It's like if you were a student that had a 95% on your test, you'd still get an A. And do we find that acceptable, that schools can actually do that?
Right. Right. So, Rita, Illinois was one of the states that already submitted their plan on April 3rd. So what can we do if I live in Illinois or if I lived in another state that's already submitted my plan?
Well, there are other opportunities for engaging as a parent advocate. So just because your state has already submitted your state plan doesn't mean there aren't other areas. First of all, districts still have to develop their education plans, and they can't do that until the state plan has been approved by the federal government. So there is a review period, and this means that, once the state plans are approved, you still have that opportunity to go in at your local district level and say, hey, these are the things that we want schools to do when they're identified for improvement. In addition, as noted before, some definitions may not be set within the state plan, and accommodations may not be set. So in Illinois, for example, English learner accommodations on assessments was not defined. So that's still an area where you could go and speak with your state policymakers like your state superintendent, or even at the district level, talk to the leaders that you know to try to get them to make sure that those accommodations are what you think are appropriate. And in addition, the states across the country are still trying to figure out, what should the reports that parents will receive from the school look like? So should it be a report card that is a one-page summary? Should it be a dashboard on the state website? These are discussions that are still being held across the country. So you can make sure that you're involved in them, and you can ask actually the school to see how you can be involved.
Yeah, and I would also add one more example in that even though Illinois submitted their plan, they also noted that they are going to define or they're going to create a new definition on how to measure English learner proficiency at the end of June. So that's another opportunity for engagement. Wrapping up some of these state plan information, we thought it'd be kind of fun to just sort of note some interesting information from other states in their state plans. One thing here is that starting in spring of next year, students in Rhode Island will actually be taking state tests from Massachusetts rather than their own Rhode Island developed tests.
Right, and that's really important to note because there's no requirement for the folks in Massachusetts to include the folks from Rhode Island in the development of those assessments. And so this is something I think where parents can definitely push back against if they want Rhode Island to either have its own assessments or to use a different set. There are two things that I found interesting when I was reading the Washington State Education Plan, and that's that Washington State is using the Smarter Balance assessments, which are developed by a different group than the PARCC assessments. And while they do provide glossaries for, I think, about 7 or 8 different languages on the Smarter Balance assessments, they don't accommodate the top 5 English learner languages that are in Washington State itself. And so that means that if you're Spanish speaking, Russian or Vietnamese or Chinese in Washington State, you're doing okay because you'll have a glossary. But if you happen to be Somali and you need a glossary, even though you're in the top 5 English learner categories in Washington State, there is nothing to help you. The other thing that I thought was really interesting, and this applies actually to a lot of states, including Illinois, is that for Washington State, they set a long-term goal for having 100% of their students proficient on all the high school assessments, but within 20 years. And their interim goal, unlike Illinois' interim goal of 3 years, is actually a 10-year goal. And so the question is, is this even appropriate? Because are your kids still going to be in school when they hit that interim goal? And so given the high rate of turnover in school leadership, it's even possible that we may have a new federal education law before Washington even hits its interim goal.
Yeah. Thanks, Rita. Those are pretty fun and interesting. All right, so even more interesting things. So as we probably heard throughout in the news, the president sent Congress his proposal for the budget for all federal agencies. And for the U.S. Department of Education, the president has proposed a total of $9 billion in cuts. So now in the process, Congress gets to decide which programs to fund or to cut and how much money each agency will actually receive. So it's important because a lot of these programs support low-income and first-generation students in K-12 and as well as in college. It's important for all of our community members to be involved and to advocate to our members of Congress about programs that are important to us, and I think programs that a lot of us, including myself and Rita, that we've gone through, that have really been key to our success in school. So as I said earlier, $9 billion being cut. So that looks like about 13.5% is being cut from what the Department of Education currently receives. Right? And one of the things here is, that wasn't noted is that the Office of Civil Rights was not specifically listed as having their budget cut, but we are concerned that because the department's overall budget is cut, this will also negatively impact the Office of Civil Rights budget, which would weaken their ability to effectively protect our students' civil rights.
And I just want us to be very clear here that the programs that are being cut are the ones geared towards low-income students and students of color. We have, for the past few years, growing numbers of students in poverty. I think since 2013, the majority of students were from low-income families. In 1989, only 1/3 of students were low-income, and we know that the numbers have been increasing year after year at both the K-12 level and in college.
And so some of the programs we wanted to highlight, right? So programs that are important to our students include, TRIO and Gear Up, the Federal Supplemental Educational Opportunity Grants, and the 21st Century Community Learning Centers. So these are all programs, that have helped low-income students either go to college and or finish college, right? So this chart is just showing these are in the millions, right? So TRIO and Gear Up, $193 million is being cut from its current budget, $732 million being cut from the Supplemental Educational Opportunity Grants, and then the 21st Century Community Learning Centers, that's $1.2 billion that's being cut, and that effectively just eliminates the entire program completely. And some of the other things that the president didn't provide specific figures for, but did note were the federal work study program. So they noted that it's being reformed, but there's no specifics on what that means, how they're reforming it, any numbers. And additionally, I think it's also important to note that about 2/3 of students attending public colleges and universities have student loans. So, cutting all these grants and financial aid for students is not necessarily a good thing. And then moving on, so the president also noted in his budget an increase in charter school funding. So basically, all this money that he's increasing, so he's increasing charter school funding by $168 million, right? So that's going to give them $468 million to fund charter schools. But that money came from all those programs that he's cutting that we noted in the previous slide, right?
And so, we want to really emphasize that while there are a number of charter schools that our community members have created to better serve the needs of our students, we do know that there are significant issues with charter schools not appropriately accommodating English language learners, their parents, and students with disabilities. SEARAC in particular is following a number of these civil rights complaints against charter schools for language services. And so we want to caution that, it's important for us to remember that even if it's a charter school, it still has to meet all of the minimum protections that are required under federal law to serve our students.
Right. So this last part is also funding for low-income students. So in the budget, we wanted to highlight this because it's actually a little tricky. They noted an increase in $1 billion to support low-income students in K-12. But this is a little deceptive because this provision is essentially, there's a provision that takes money from a lot of public schools that are already under-resourced and have high concentrations of low-income students. And then as the students leave these schools, that money follows them. And so it effectively takes money out of these public schools. But what's also important to note is that, you know, we've seen examples of this in the past, and, you know, students have lost a lot of their civil rights protections when they've moved to private schools, especially students with disabilities.
Right, and just so folks know, what does this mean? You know, under federal law, there is a rigorous legal process that a school has to go through if you have a student with a disability. And this is the creation of an individualized education plan for how the student will be accommodated in the classroom, how the student will be accommodated on testing, and, you know, so this is the sort of process that if you move to a private school with your voucher money, you don't necessarily have access to the same process. And it's been noted, I think there are actually some news articles about it where parents have signed away some of their rights for their students with disabilities when they go to private schools. And so we really caution, you know, supporting taking money out of public schools for this reason. Okay, so now I'm going to switch over to one of the big issues that SEARAC is working on right now, and that's on federal data collection. There's actually a unique opportunity for us, which doesn't happen often, and that's the Office of Management and Budget, OMB for short, is currently updating the federal government standards for how they collect race and ethnicity data. The last time they did this was 10 years ago in 1997. So what's really at stake here? And that's that OMB sets the minimum requirements for all of the data that's collected across all federal programs and surveys. And so this is a fantastic opportunity for us to try to get more disaggregated data on our communities beyond just Asian and beyond Pacific Islander. So how can you be involved? There's actually a process for submitting public comments to OMB, and that you can do that up till midnight Eastern time on April 30th, and you can tell them directly that you want them to collect more data on our communities. So I think for those on this call, we don't really have to tell you why it's important to have additional API data. You know, this just helps guarantee that with more data, there will be more programs and services offered to our communities. So just really quickly, I've shared with you on this slide how you can comment on this. And remember that anyone who lives in the US, regardless of citizenship status, can comment on this particular need. And if you go to bit.ly Federal API Data 2017, I've created a shortcut for you so that you can easily share and provide comments. And we've created a little script here where you want them to collect data using the US Census National Content Test final report categories, which will include Cambodian, Hmong, Laotian, and Vietnamese. And also it's important to include in there why it's important to you personally, because they're going to receive a lot of comments. And I think the more you personalize it, the more compelling it is. And they do look at the different reasons for why you want this data. So it's not enough to just tell them that you want it. You have to say why. And then I would also end with, you know, who you are in terms of your ethnicity, just to let them know that, you know, you are speaking as a member of that community. So what we've also done to help you out with this is to give you some specific examples for why it's important. And you can customize these for your own particular area. So one of them may be that your school doesn't provide any translators in your language for parent-teacher conferences, even though that is actually required by law. It may be that your school doesn't do it because they don't recognize that there are a lot of Cambodian Americans in your area. The second example is a high school dropout rate. You know, I actually was in a high school where a lot of people didn't even know I was Cambodian American. They assumed I was Chinese, and they thought that, you know, all the Asian students in my school were doing well. The third, we've shared with you just some statistics on how many students have not attended college, and noted that, you know, this isn't true for all states, but in a lot of areas, scholarships and college outreach programs are not geared towards our communities. Okay.
Thank you, Rita. So just wrapping up our webinar and our call a little bit here. So if you want to, you know, stay engaged and continue advocating, here we've listed a few things that you can do. So one thing is you can join our API education stakeholder list. You know, we'll put you on our listserv, and as we send out updates and information about what's going on in national, state, and federal education policies, as well as any action alerts we might have.
Yep, and the second thing you can do is to review and comment on your state education plan. You know, if it's already been submitted, it's still important to review it because there may be a revision that is required from the federal government. In that case, you want to be up to date on it.
Yep, and you could also just call your member of Congress, right, and you know, talk to them about you know, these programs that have really helped you and other community members succeed, right, and advocating for them to stop these proposed education budget cuts.
The last thing you can do is to submit comments on the importance of API data disaggregation to OMB. I think that's an issue that cuts across all policy areas for our community, but it's especially urgent now since they may not be updating these standards for another 10 years.
Yeah, and so this last thing is, so we've listed a few resources if you'd like to learn some more about the topics we've discussed today. These are hyperlinks. Now I know you can only view this, but in your dashboard, at the bottom of your dashboard, there's a section for handouts. So we've also loaded this PowerPoint on there, and you can download it, and then you'll have access to all of these links, as well as the ones in the previous slide if you wanted to submit comments or join our API stakeholder list.
All right, and I think now it's time to open it up for questions. So if you have any questions, we'll be checking the chat box or we'll be unmuting you so you can ask.
Yeah, so we'll give folks a few minutes, and I'm just going to go back to the top here just so that folks can see there. So this screenshot of where folks, you know, you want to raise your hand, you see this icon, this hand icon here with the green arrow, raise that, and I can unmute you and you can ask your question. Or if you prefer, you can send us a question in the chat box down. Yeah. So we just had one question come in. So Rita, have you heard any updates on the D2 grant?
Unfortunately, as we've been talking with Department of Education folks, we do not know whether the funding will continue for D2. So I think this is actually an area where you can call your congressman and let them know that you would like D2 funding for API data disaggregation, technical support from the Department of Education and grants to continue. So, this is something that I think is really important for our communities.
Great, thank you. And I think I'd also just like to note that right now, the D2 grant program is currently in implementation mode. The states that had received it, Hawaii, Minnesota, Washington, they're currently trying to implement that over a span of 5 years. So hopefully we'll also learn some things from their work.
We're going to wait another minute or two for additional questions.
All right, well, I think, we don't see any more questions. So thank you everybody for joining us on this beautiful afternoon. Just as a reminder, if you want a copy of these slides, if you go down to the handouts section of your dashboard, you can download it there. We will also be uploading this onto YouTube. So if you missed any part of this webinar, you can watch the whole thing again. There'll be a survey after this webinar that will sort of just ask you some more questions about future webinar topics that we would appreciate hearing from you.
All right. Thank you very much, everybody, and goodbye.